The diamond caught the afternoon sunlight streaming through Ivy Hughes's office window like a blade cutting through Levi Burke's chest. He stood frozen in her doorway, the quarterly reports he'd come to discuss forgotten in his hands, watching as she gestured excitedly to someone on the phone. The engagement ring on her finger sparkled with each movement, a brilliant beacon announcing to the world what Levi had spent 8 years secretly dreading. She was someone else's now. His coffee cup began to tremble in his free hand, just slightly at first, then with increasing intensity as the reality crashed over him in waves. 8 years of silent devotion, 8 years of loving her from the shadows, 8 years of hoping that someday, somehow, she might see him as more than just her boss. All of it ending with the flash of a diamond that cost more than most people's cars. "I know, Mom, I'm still getting used to it too," Ivy was saying into her phone, unconsciously twisting the ring as she spoke. Kai did such a wonderful job picking it out. The proposal was perfect, just like something out of a movie. Perfect. The word echoed in Levi's mind with bitter irony. Of course it had been perfect. Kai Jenkins was the kind of man who planned perfect proposals in perfect restaurants with perfect rings for perfect women. He was everything Levi had convinced himself he could never be: confident, uncomplicated, the obvious choice for someone like Ivy Hughes. "Levi? Are you all right?" Ivy's voice cut through his spiral of devastation. She'd ended her call and was looking at him with concern, those expressive dark eyes that had haunted his dreams for nearly a decade now focused entirely on him. Even now, even as she was telling him about her engagement to another man, her first instinct was to worry about others. It was one of the countless reasons he'd fallen so completely, so hopelessly in love with her. "I'm fine," he managed, though the words felt like glass in his throat. "Congratulations on your engagement." The lie tasted bitter, but what else could he say? That he'd spent 8 years memorizing the way she laughed when she was truly delighted? That he knew she always tucked her hair behind her left ear when she was concentrating because he'd watched her do it through countless meetings? That every business decision he'd made had been influenced by whether it would benefit her career? That he'd built an empire but would trade it all for one real chance to be the man who put that ring on her finger? "Thank you," Ivy said, her smile radiant in a way that made his chest tighten with loss. "I'm still getting used to the idea myself. Everything happened so fast." Fast. The irony wasn't lost on him. Kai had known her for 18 months and had moved quickly to claim her heart. Levi had known her for 8 years and had been too much of a coward to even try. The ring caught the light again as she gestured, and Levi felt something fundamental break inside his chest. It was beautiful, classic solitaire setting, substantial diamond, everything a woman like Ivy deserved. Kai had excellent taste, he'd give him that. Those hands that Levi had dreamed of holding, those fingers he'd imagined intertwining with his during the lonely nights when he allowed himself impossible fantasies, now wore another man's promise. "Tell me about it," he heard himself say, though every word was torture. "The proposal." Ivy's eyes lit up, and she settled back in her chair with the kind of animated excitement he'd seen her display when discussing marketing campaigns that truly inspired her. Except this time, she was discussing the moment another man had claimed her heart. "It was so romantic," she said, and there was something in her voice, a quality he couldn't quite identify. Was it genuine enthusiasm, or the tone of someone trying to convince themselves of something? "He took me to Le Bernardin, you know, that French place downtown with the incredible wine list. There was a string quartet playing, and he'd arranged for them to play our song when he got down on one knee." Our song. The phrase hit him like a physical blow because it meant they had a song, shared memories, intimate moments that belonged only to them. It meant that while Levi had been loving her silently, Kai had been building a real relationship with her, the kind with inside jokes and special songs and futures planned together. He'd been planning it for months, Ivy continued, and the word months echoed in Levi's mind with devastating irony. Months of planning while Levi had been loving her for years. "He said he knew I was the one after our third date, but he wanted to make sure the proposal was absolutely perfect. Perfect again. That word that seemed to define everything about Kai Jenkins and everything Levi wasn't. "I was completely surprised," Ivy said, though something flickered in her expression, so briefly Levi might have imagined it. "I mean, I knew we were serious, but I hadn't expected." "Well, I hadn't expected it to happen so soon." The hesitation in her voice was subtle, probably unnoticeable to anyone who hadn't spent 8 years learning to read her every expression, every inflection. But Levi caught it, and it made him study her face more carefully. There was something subdued about her usual radiance, something that didn't quite match the excitement of someone who'd just gotten engaged to the love of their life. When Ivy talked about things that truly thrilled her, a successful campaign, a breakthrough idea, a project that challenged her, she gesticulated wildly, her voice taking on a musical quality that made even mundane topics sound fascinating. But discussing what should be the most exciting event of her life, she seemed almost polite. As if she were reciting a story she'd heard rather than sharing her own experience. Or maybe that was wishful thinking on his part. Maybe he was seeing what he desperately wanted to see because the alternative, accepting that she was genuinely, completely happy with another man, was too devastating to bear. "When's the wedding?" he asked, proud that his voice came out steady and appropriately interested. "We're thinking spring," she said, twisting the ring again in what he was beginning to recognize as a nervous habit. "Nothing too elaborate. Kai wants something elegant but intimate. His family has very specific ideas about what constitutes a proper wedding." His family. Already, Ivy was being absorbed into the Jenkins family expectations, her own preferences subordinated to their vision of propriety. Levi wanted to ask what she wanted, what would make her happy, but he had no right to those questions. He was her boss, nothing more, despite the years of careful attention and silent devotion. "That sounds lovely," he said instead, each word a small death. The quarterly reports in his hands felt suddenly heavy, a reminder of why he'd come to her office in the first place. Business. Professional obligations. The careful dance of propriety they'd maintained for 8 years, even as his heart had been slowly breaking with want. If you haven't already, hit that subscribe button and join our Dear Love Diaries family. Your special place in this community of heartfelt stories is waiting for you. These passionate journeys of souls connecting against all odds have brought together thousands of beautiful hearts just like yours. Make sure you hit the bell too, so you'll know immediately when a new story unfolds in our diary of love. Looking at Ivy now, truly looking at her, not just stealing glances during meetings or watching her from across conference rooms, Levi tried to reconcile this moment with the journey that had brought them here. 8 years ago, she'd been Ivy Hughes, fresh MBA graduate with determination blazing in her eyes and a portfolio clutched against her chest like armor. He'd been Levi Burke, then just the brilliant but quietly intense head of technology development, already building what would become Burke Industries into the digital transformation empire it was today. She'd walked into that first team meeting, and his world had tilted on its axis. It hadn't been love at first sight. That was fairy tale nonsense. It had been recognition at first sight, as if some part of his soul had been waiting his entire life for her to walk through that door. She'd been assigned to the marketing department, but from day one, Levi had found excuses to collaborate with her team, to offer technical insights for her campaigns, to be in meetings where her brilliant mind could solve problems others couldn't even identify. In a world where most people saw him as either a stepping stone to success or an obstacle to navigate around, Ivy had simply seen him as a person. She'd asked his opinion not because she needed his approval, but because she genuinely valued his perspective. She'd brought him coffee during late-night coding sessions when everyone else had gone home. She'd remembered his birthday when his own assistant had forgotten. She'd been kind without wanting anything in return, brilliant without needing to prove it, and beautiful in a way that had made him believe in poetry again. And he'd been too afraid to tell her any of it. Instead, he'd loved her silently, carefully, from whatever distance seemed safest. When she'd struggled with the Memphis account in her second year, he'd somehow arranged for the exact technical specifications she needed to land on her desk, along with the contact information for 3 potential vendors who could execute her vision. When she'd been passed over for the Morrison promotion despite being clearly the most qualified candidate, he'd created a new position that perfectly matched her skills and came with both a substantial raise and the autonomy she craved. When she'd mentioned wanting to attend the International Marketing Summit in Barcelona, he'd personally ensured the company would not only cover her expenses but also give her the time off and the research budget to make the trip truly worthwhile. For 8 years, he'd been her invisible guardian angel, orchestrating opportunities and removing obstacles while never taking credit for any of it. He'd watched her bloom into the confident, successful executive she was today, and he'd told himself it was enough. That being part of her world in any capacity was more than he deserved. He'd been lying to himself. The truth was, every promotion he'd arranged for her had been motivated by the selfish hope that her success might somehow make him worthy of her attention. Every obstacle he'd removed had been driven by the desperate need to see her smile, to watch her eyes light up with achievement. Every late night he'd spent ensuring her projects had the resources they needed had been powered by the fantasy that someday, she might see past his careful professional distance to the man who would move heaven and earth for her happiness. The Patterson project is moving to phase 2, he said now, forcing his mind back to the present, to the business that had brought him to her office. The client is impressed with our preliminary results. That's wonderful news, Ivy said, and her professional enthusiasm was genuine, even if her personal excitement felt forced. What kind of timeline are they looking at? Aggressive. They want a full proposal by month's end. He paused, studying her face. It would mean some long nights, probably weekend sessions. With your wedding planning, I can delegate to someone else if you'd prefer. No, she said quickly, and something in her voice made him look at her more closely. I want to see this through. This is my project. There was an urgency in her response that seemed disproportionate to a simple work assignment. As if the Patterson project represented something more than professional achievement. Perhaps a refuge from wedding planning that felt overwhelming rather than exciting. Are you sure? He pressed gently. Planning a wedding is a full-time job, or so I'm told. Kai is handling most of the details, she said, and again, Levi caught that subtle note of something he couldn't quite identify. He has very specific ideas about what he wants. What he wants. Not what they want, not what would make them both happy. What Kai wants. The distinction was subtle but telling, and it made Levi wonder, not for the first time, whether Ivy Hughes was truly as happy as she claimed to be. Whether the woman who had spent 8 years fighting for her own vision in every professional context was somehow allowing someone else to plan the most important day of her life. Well, he said carefully, if you're sure about taking on the extra workload, I'm grateful. No one understands the client's vision better than you do. It was true. Ivy had an intuitive understanding of what clients needed before they knew they needed it, a gift for translating complex technical solutions into compelling marketing narratives. She was brilliant at her job, passionate about her work, and absolutely irreplaceable. She was also, he realized with devastating clarity, about to marry a man who seemed more interested in planning the perfect wedding than in understanding what would make his bride genuinely happy. The thought should have comforted him. If Ivy wasn't truly happy with Kai, perhaps there was still hope. Instead, it filled him with a protective fury that had nowhere to go. Because even if she was settling for a safe, comfortable relationship instead of waiting for passionate love, it wasn't his place to say anything. She'd made her choice, and his job was to respect it, not to interfere with her happiness. Even if that happiness looked hollow from where he stood. I should let you get back to your calls, he said, gathering the reports he'd barely glanced at. We can discuss the Patterson timeline tomorrow. Actually, Ivy said, and something in her voice made him pause in the doorway. Would you like to have dinner Thursday? To go over the project parameters, I mean. Somewhere we can spread out the documents and really dig into the details. Dinner. Alone. The invitation sent an inappropriate thrill through his chest, followed immediately by guilt. She was engaged now, which meant their professional dinners, already a form of exquisite torture, would become even more complicated. "Are you sure that's appropriate?" he asked. "Given your engagement?" The question seemed to surprise her, as if the thought hadn't occurred to her. "It's just business," she said, but there was something uncertain in her voice. "Isn't it? Was it just business?" Levi looked at her, really looked at her. And saw the woman who had unknowingly held his heart for 8 years. The woman whose laugh could make his worst days bearable, whose approval meant more to him than any board of directors, whose happiness he'd been orchestrating from the shadows since the day they met. No, it had never been just business between them. But it was the only thing it could ever be. "Of course," he said. "I'll make a reservation somewhere quiet." "Thank you," she said, and her smile was warmer than the situation warranted. "I'm looking forward to it." As Levi walked back to his corner office, past the floor-to-ceiling windows that showcased the empire he'd built, past the photographs and awards that documented his professional success, he felt the weight of 8 years of silence pressing down on him like a physical burden. In his private office, he closed the door and allowed himself a moment of weakness. He closed his eyes and let the careful composure slip, let the pain wash over him in waves that threatened to drown him. 8 years. 8 years of falling deeper in love with a woman who would never see him as anything more than a colleague. 8 years of watching her date other men, of listening to her hopes and dreams, of being the person she turned to for professional advice while remaining invisible in every way that mattered. 8 years of telling himself that loving her silently was noble, selfless, enough. It wasn't enough. It had never been enough. And now it was too late. The intercom on his desk buzzed softly. "Mr. Burke?" Micah Nichols, his assistant and the closest thing he had to a best friend, spoke through the speaker. "Diana called. She wants to confirm dinner Sunday night." Diana. His younger sister, the one person in the world who could read him like an open book. She'd been asking pointed questions about his personal life lately, questions he'd been deflecting with increasing difficulty. If Diana saw him now, she'd know immediately that something was wrong. "Tell her I'll be there," Levi said, proud that his voice came out steady. "Sir? Is everything all right? You sound..." "I'm fine, Micah." The lie was becoming easier with practice. "Just tired." But as he sat alone in his office, surrounded by the trappings of success that felt meaningless without someone to share them with, Levi Burke finally acknowledged the truth he'd been avoiding for 8 years. He wasn't fine. He wasn't tired. He was heartbroken. And for the first time in his adult life, he had absolutely no idea what to do about it. Outside his office windows, the city sprawled beneath the afternoon sky, millions of people living their lives, making their choices, finding their happiness. Somewhere in that vast landscape, Ivy Hughes was planning a wedding to a man who had been brave enough to claim her heart. And Levi Burke was left to wonder what might have been different if he'd found that same courage 8 years ago. If he'd been brave enough to fight for the woman he loved instead of loving her safely from the shadows. If he'd chosen to risk everything for a chance at happiness instead of protecting himself from the possibility of rejection. If he'd learned sooner that the greatest tragedy wasn't loving someone who didn't love you back, it was never giving them the chance to try. Chapter 2. The elevator doors whispered shut at 8:47 p.m. on Thursday evening, sealing Ivy Hughes and Levi Burke into 8 square feet of polished steel that suddenly felt smaller than a coffin. The Patterson Project materials were tucked safely in Ivy's leather portfolio, evidence of another productive late-night work session, but the real electricity in the confined space had nothing to do with quarterly projections and everything to do with the unbearable tension that had been building between them for the past 3 days. Since the engagement announcement. Since that devastating moment when Levi had seen the diamond on her finger and his carefully constructed world had crumbled. Ivy stood pressed against the far wall, her back rigid against the cool steel, clutching her portfolio like a shield. The engagement ring felt heavy on her finger tonight, heavier than it had any right to be, considering she'd chosen the lightest setting Kai had shown her. She'd been hyper-aware of it all evening, catching herself twisting it nervously whenever Levi's attention focused too intently on her face. Which had been happening with disturbing frequency. Levi occupied the opposite corner, his hands buried deep in his pockets, his jaw tight with what she was beginning to recognize as barely controlled tension. 3 days of maintaining professional distance had taken their toll on both of them. 3 days of careful politeness and meaningful glances and conversations that danced around everything they couldn't say. The air between them crackled with unspoken words. "Thank you for dinner," Ivy said, her voice unnaturally bright in the silence. The Patterson strategy session was incredibly productive. It had been productive, though not for the reasons she was claiming. Yes, they'd mapped out the client's technical requirements and identified potential implementation challenges. But what had really made the evening memorable was the way Levi had listened to her ideas with the kind of focused attention that made her feel like the most fascinating person in the world. The way he'd remembered exactly how she liked her coffee before she'd even ordered. The way he'd unconsciously leaned closer when she was explaining her marketing vision, close enough that she could smell his cologne and feel the warmth radiating from his body. The way he'd looked at her when he thought she wasn't paying attention, as if she were something precious and fragile that he was afraid to touch. "You're brilliant at reading client psychology," Levi said, his voice rougher than usual. "The way you identified their real concerns beneath the stated requirements, it's exactly why this project will succeed." The compliment should have felt professional, collegial. Instead, it sent warmth flooding through her chest in a way that had nothing to do with career satisfaction and everything to do with the man delivering it. "It helps that I have a technical genius translating my wild ideas into actual solutions," she replied, then immediately regretted the intimacy in her tone. The elevator shuddered slightly as it passed the 15th floor, and Ivy stumbled forward. The movement was small, barely noticeable, but in the confined space it brought her close enough to Levi that she could see the flecks of gold in his dark eyes. Close enough to notice the way his breathing had quickened. Close enough to realize that the attraction she'd been trying to ignore for weeks, months, if she was being honest, wasn't one-sided. "Ivy," he said, her name coming out like a prayer, like a warning, like a confession all wrapped into one. "I know," she whispered, though she didn't know anything except that standing this close to him made rational thought impossible. His hands came up to steady her, his fingers closing around her upper arms with careful restraint. Through the silk of her blouse, his touch burned like a brand, sending electric shocks racing through her nervous system. This close, she could see the tension in his jaw, the way his pupils had dilated despite the elevator's bright lighting. This close, she could feel the carefully controlled power in his touch, as if he were holding himself back from something that would shatter them both. "You're engaged," he said, and the word sounded like he was reminding himself as much as her. "I am." The admission felt like ash in her mouth. "To a good man who loves you." "Yes." Though even as she said it, she wondered when "good man who loves me" had started feeling like a prison sentence instead of a blessing. "And I'm your boss." "Yes," she agreed, though the corporate hierarchy seemed meaningless when he was touching her like this, looking at her like she was the answer to every question he'd ever asked. "This is inappropriate," he said, but his thumbs were moving across her arms in the barest caress, and she felt her breath catch. "Completely inappropriate," she agreed, making no move to step away. The elevator dinged softly, announcing their arrival at the parking level, but neither of them moved toward the opening doors. They remained frozen in their tableau of impossible longing, both understanding that stepping apart would mean returning to the careful professional distance that was slowly killing them both. "Ivy," Levi said again, and this time her name sounded like goodbye. The finality in his voice broke something loose in her chest. Before she could stop herself, before rational thought could intervene, she found herself asking the question that had been haunting her for days. What if I wasn't engaged? The words hung between them like a bridge she couldn't cross and couldn't bring herself to burn. Levi's eyes searched her face as if looking for some sign that she didn't mean it, that she was testing him or playing some cruel game. "You are engaged," he said carefully. "But what if I wasn't?" she pressed, surprising herself with her persistence. "What if I was free? What would happen then?" Levi's grip on her arms tightened almost imperceptibly. When he spoke, his voice was rough with emotion he wasn't even trying to hide anymore. "If you weren't engaged," he said slowly, "I would tell you that I've been in love with you since the day you walked into Burke Industries. I would tell you that every success you've achieved, every opportunity that's come your way, every door that's opened for you, I've been behind it, making sure you had every chance to shine." The confession hit her like a physical blow, stealing her breath and making her knees weak. "What?" "I would tell you that I know you take your coffee with just a touch of vanilla creamer because I'm the one who makes sure the office kitchen is always stocked with your favorite brand. I would tell you that I created the Morrison position specifically for you because watching you get passed over for that promotion nearly killed me. Levi, I would tell you that I've spent 8 years loving you from the shadows, 8 years orchestrating your success while telling myself that being part of your world in any capacity was enough." His voice grew rougher with each word. "I would tell you that it's never been enough, and that seeing another man's ring on your finger is destroying me." The elevator doors started to close, triggered by their extended stay, but Levi reached out without looking to hold them open. The gesture was automatic, protective, as if even in the middle of the most important conversation of his life, his first instinct was to take care of her. 8 years, she whispered. 8 years, he confirmed. "Since the moment you walked into that first team meeting with your portfolio clutched against your chest and that determined look in your eyes. Since the first time you smiled at me and I realized what poets meant when they wrote about love at first sight." The revelation was devastating and beautiful and completely overwhelming. Because if he'd been in love with her for 8 years, then every kindness, every opportunity, every moment of support, it had all come from love. He'd been silently, selflessly orchestrating her happiness without ever expecting anything in return. "I never knew," she said, though even as the words left her mouth, she wondered if that was entirely true. Hadn't she noticed how he seemed to anticipate her needs? How opportunities always seemed to arise just when she needed them most. How he looked at her sometimes during meetings as if she were the most fascinating person in the room. "You weren't supposed to know," Levi said. "You were building something incredible, and I didn't want to complicate your life with feelings you didn't return." "How do you know I didn't return them?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, but once spoken, she couldn't take it back. Levi's hands stilled on her arms, his eyes searching her face with desperate intensity. "Do you?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Have you ever felt anything?" The honest answer was yes. Not love. Not the deep, abiding devotion he'd carried for her, but something. A pull toward him that she'd dismissed as inappropriate workplace attraction. A comfort in his presence that had made their professional relationship feel more personal than it should have. A flutter in her chest whenever he smiled at her with genuine warmth instead of polite professionalism. "I've felt something," she admitted. "But I told myself it was just professional admiration. Respect for your intelligence and success." And now? Now she was standing in his arms feeling like she was exactly where she belonged. Now she was realizing that every relationship she'd had over the past 8 years had been unconsciously measured against the impossible standard of how Levi Burke made her feel with nothing more than his attention. Now she was understanding that the safety she'd sought with Kai was really just a shield against the terrifying intensity of what she felt for the man holding her. "Now I think I've been lying to myself," she whispered. Something broke in Levi's expression, hope, relief, desire all tangled together in a way that made her chest tight with emotion. His forehead dropped to rest against hers, and for a moment they simply breathed the same air, sharing the same impossible space. "Ivy," he said, and her name was a prayer on his lips. I know this is complicated, she said. I know there are a dozen reasons why we can't. We can't, he agreed, but his hands were framing her face now, his thumbs tracing the line of her cheekbones with reverent gentleness. My engagement is to a man who deserves better than a woman who's falling in love with someone else. The words hung between them like truth neither of them was ready to face. Because that's what was happening, wasn't it? She was falling in love with Levi Burke while wearing another man's ring, and the guilt of it was eating her alive. This is so unfair to Kai, she said, though she made no move to step away from Levi's touch. And it's unfair to you to marry a man you don't love completely. I do love him, but not the way you could love me. The statement was quiet, certain, and absolutely devastating in its honesty. Because he was right. What she felt for Kai was affection, compatibility, gratitude for his steadiness. What she felt for Levi was something altogether more dangerous. A consuming need that made her question every choice she'd ever made. Mr. Burke? Ms. Hughes? A security guard's voice echoed across the parking garage, shattering the moment like glass. Everything all right over there? Reality crashed back into focus. They were standing in an elevator, in her arms, having the kind of conversation that could destroy both their careers and her engagement. They were taking risks that mature, responsible adults shouldn't take, crossing lines that couldn't be uncrossed. Levi dropped his hands and stepped back so quickly he hit the elevator wall. The loss of his touch left Ivy feeling cold and bereft, as if something essential had been taken away. Fine, Levi called back, his voice perfectly controlled despite the chaos she could see in his eyes. Just reviewing project timelines. Another lie to add to the growing collection they were building between them. They walked to their cars in silence, the weight of unspoken words heavy in the air. At her sedan, Ivy fumbled with her keys, her hands shaking from the adrenaline of the moment and the magnitude of what had almost happened. Ivy. Levi's voice stopped her as she was about to get into her car. He stood beside his own vehicle, a sleek black Aston Martin that suited him perfectly. His expression carefully neutral except for his eyes. Those eyes that held 8 years of love and longing and the terrible knowledge that wanting something didn't make it possible. Yes? What happens now? It was the question she'd been asking herself since the moment he'd confessed 8 years of silent devotion. What did happen now? How did you go back to professional distance after learning that your boss had been orchestrating your success out of love? How did you plan a wedding to one man while falling in love with another? How did you choose between the life you'd planned and the life you were just beginning to imagine? I don't know, she said honestly. I can transfer to a different department, he offered. Remove myself from the situation to make it easier for you. Don't you dare. The fierceness in her voice surprised them both. Burke Industries is your company. I won't let you exile yourself because of this. Then what do you suggest? I suggest, she said slowly, working through the words as she spoke them, that we both take some time to think about what we want. What we really want, not what we think we should want. Levi nodded, though she could see the reluctance in his expression. And in the meantime? In the meantime, we try to figure out how to work together without this destroying us both. It was an impossible task, and they both knew it. How did you maintain professional distance from someone who just confessed 8 years of love? How did you focus on quarterly projections when all you could think about was the way his hands had felt on your skin? How did you go home to your fiancé and pretend your world hadn't shifted on its axis? Drive carefully, Levi said, and even that simple concern made her chest tight with emotion. You too. She got into her car without looking back, though she could feel his eyes on her until she turned the corner and disappeared into traffic. The drive home gave her time to process what had just happened, time to understand the magnitude of the choice that was now before her. Because that's what tonight had been, not just a confession, but a crossroads. A moment when the life she'd been living collided with the life she could have, and she had to decide which path to take. The apartment she shared with Kai felt different when she walked through the door. Smaller somehow, as if the space couldn't contain both her old life and the possibilities that had opened up in that elevator. Kai was on the couch reviewing wedding vendors, surrounded by brochures and contracts and evidence of the future they were building together. "How was your work dinner?" he asked, looking up with the kind smile that had drawn her to him in the first place. "Productive," she said, and added another lie to her growing collection. "Good. I found 3 more caterers for us to try." He gestured to the coffee table covered with glossy photos of elaborate wedding cakes and elegant table settings. "I thought we could do tastings this weekend." Wedding planning. The future she'd committed to, the life she'd agreed to build. Looking at the evidence of Kai's careful preparation, his excitement about their big day, Ivy felt guilt settle over her like a weight. "That sounds great," she said, though the words felt foreign in her mouth. As she got ready for bed, Ivy caught sight of herself in the bathroom mirror. The woman looking back at her seemed like a stranger, flushed with emotion, eyes bright with possibilities she'd never considered, engagement ring feeling like a foreign object on her finger. "I'd love to know, have you ever loved someone who didn't know you existed? Share your story in the comments below. Your experiences create this beautiful tapestry of human connection that makes our community so special." That night, as Kai slept peacefully beside her, Ivy stared at the ceiling and tried to make sense of the chaos in her heart. 8 years. Levi Burke had loved her for 8 years while she'd built a life that didn't include him. He'd orchestrated her success from the shadows, had been the invisible force behind every opportunity, every stroke of luck, every moment when things had worked out exactly as she'd needed them to. And she'd never known. But now she did know, and that knowledge changed everything. It recontextualized every interaction they'd ever had, every late-night working session, every moment when she'd felt drawn to him in ways she hadn't understood. It explained why no other relationship had ever felt quite right, why she'd always felt like she was settling for good enough instead of waiting for extraordinary. It explained why accepting Kai's proposal had felt more like resignation than celebration. Beside her, Kai stirred in his sleep, and Ivy felt the familiar comfort of his presence. He was a good man, kind, stable, devoted to building a life with her. He deserved better than a fiancé who was lying awake thinking about another man. But did she deserve better than a marriage built on gratitude rather than passion? The question followed her into restless dreams where she was running through endless corridors, searching for something she couldn't name, always just out of reach. In her dreams, Levi's voice called her name, but when she turned to find him, all she could see was the flash of her engagement ring catching light like a beacon warning her away from the life she really wanted. She woke before dawn with the taste of regret bitter in her mouth and the absolute certainty that everything was about to change. The only question was whether she'd have the courage to choose the change herself, or whether it would choose her. 3 floors above her in his penthouse apartment, Levi Burke stood at his floor-to-ceiling windows watching the sun rise over the city he'd conquered through sheer force of will. The empire he'd built stretched out below him, but all he could think about was the woman who'd made it all meaningful. The woman who was engaged to someone else. The woman who'd admitted to feeling something for him. The woman who was going to force him to make an impossible choice between his heart and his honor. 8 years of loving her silently, and now she knew. The secret was out, the careful distance destroyed, the professional relationship forever altered. There was no going back to the way things were. The only question was whether there was a way forward that didn't destroy them both. Chapter 3. The bridal boutique felt like a beautiful prison. Ivy stood on the pedestal in front of 3 floor-to-ceiling mirrors, surrounded by yards of ivory silk and French lace, while her mother and future mother-in-law debated the merits of cathedral versus chapel veils. The dress was stunning, everything a bride should want, but all she could think about was how Levi's hands had felt on her arms 3 nights ago in that elevator. How his voice had broken when he'd confessed 8 years of silent love. How nothing in her carefully planned life had felt real since that moment. "You look absolutely radiant, darling," her mother gushed, dabbing at her eyes with a tissue. Kai won't know what hit him when he sees you walking down that aisle. The aisle. Toward a man she cared about but didn't love with the desperate intensity that made breathing difficult. Toward a future that looked perfect on paper but felt like suffocation. The beadwork is exquisite, Mrs. Jenkins added, adjusting the dress's intricate detailing. This will photograph beautifully at the cathedral. The cathedral that Kai had chosen because it would accommodate his extended family and create the kind of elegant wedding photos that would look impressive in their social circle. Not because it held meaning for either of them, not because it was where Ivy had dreamed of getting married, but because it fit the image of the life they were supposed to want. "What do you think, sweetheart?" her mother asked, her voice bright with anticipation. "Should we say yes to the dress?" Ivy stared at her reflection, at the woman in the perfect dress planning the perfect wedding to the perfect man, and felt like she was looking at a stranger. Where was the woman who had stood in Levi's arms feeling more alive than she had in years? Where was the person who had spent 8 years unknowingly being loved with a devotion that bordered on worship? "It's beautiful," she said automatically, because it was. "But maybe I should think about it a little longer?" The silence that followed spoke volumes. Both women exchanged glances that conveyed years of wedding planning experience and thinly veiled frustration with a bride who couldn't seem to make decisions about her own wedding. "Darling," her mother said gently, "the wedding is in 5 months. If we don't start making firm decisions soon, all the best vendors will be booked." 5 months. The timeline felt both impossibly far away and terrifyingly immediate. 5 months to figure out whether she was making the biggest mistake of her life. 5 months to decide between the safe choice and the possibility of something extraordinary. "I know, Mom. You're absolutely right." Ivy forced a smile that felt like it might crack her face. "Let me just try on one more style. To be completely sure." What she really wanted was to try on the simple, elegant sheath dress she'd noticed in the corner. The one without elaborate beadwork and dramatic trains, the one that looked like something a woman might choose for herself rather than for the photographs. But when she mentioned it, both mothers dismissed it as too understated and not special enough for such an important day. Not special enough. As if the woman wearing the dress wasn't what made the day special. By the time they left the boutique, dress unpurchased, decision postponed yet again. Ivy felt emotionally depleted in a way that had nothing to do with physical exhaustion. She was tired of smiling and nodding while other people planned her life. Tired of pretending enthusiasm for choices that felt more like obligations than dreams. Tired of being grateful for a future that felt like a beautifully decorated cage. Her phone buzzed with a text from Kai. "How did dress shopping go? Can't wait to hear all about it. Dinner tonight at Romano's?" Romano's. Their usual place, where Kai would order for both of them because he knew her preferences, where he'd discuss wedding plans with the kind of detailed enthusiasm that should have been infectious but instead felt overwhelming. "Rain check," she texted back. "Long day. Maybe tomorrow?" His response came immediately, "Of course, love. Get some rest. Can't wait to hear about the dress when you're ready. Love." Such a simple word that should have warmed her heart but instead made her feel hollow with guilt. Because Kai did love her, steadily, dependably, with the kind of devotion that women were supposed to want. And she did love him, in her way. But sitting in her car outside the bridal boutique, Ivy finally admitted what she'd been avoiding for weeks: loving someone and being in love with them were not the same thing at all. Monday morning arrived gray and drizzling, perfectly matching Ivy's internal weather. She dressed carefully for work, a burgundy suit that she knew complemented her complexion, while secretly wondering if Levi would notice. The thought made her feel simultaneously pathetic and thrilled, like a teenager with an inappropriate crush. Except this wasn't a crush. This was something far more dangerous. The Patterson presentation was scheduled for 10 o'clock, which meant 2 hours in a conference room with Levi, trying to focus on client requirements while hyper-aware of every breath he took, every gesture he made, every moment when his attention focused on her with that intensity that made her feel like the only person in the world. She arrived at the office early, hoping to center herself before facing him, but found Simone waiting by her desk with coffee and the kind of pointed expression that meant uncomfortable questions were inevitable. "So," Simone said without preamble, settling into the chair across from Ivy's desk. "How was dress shopping with the mothers?" "Enlightening," Ivy said, accepting the coffee gratefully. "Enlightening how? Did you find the dress?" "Still deciding." The words were becoming her default response to anything wedding-related. Simone's perfectly sculpted eyebrows rose. "Still deciding? Girl, you've been still deciding about everything wedding-related for weeks. At some point, you're going to have to actually make choices." "I know that." "Do you? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks like you're sabotaging your own wedding." Simone leaned forward, her expression growing serious. "The question is why?" Before Ivy could answer. Before she could figure out how to explain the chaos in her heart without revealing Levi's confession, there was a knock on her office door. Both women looked up to see the man himself standing in the doorway, looking devastatingly handsome in a charcoal suit that made his dark eyes look almost black. For a moment, their gazes met and held, and Ivy felt the world narrow down to just the two of them. 3 days since the elevator, since his confession, since everything had changed, and she still felt that electric shock of awareness every time she saw him. "I'm sorry to interrupt," he said, his voice carefully controlled. "I wanted to review the Patterson materials before the presentation." "Of course," Ivy managed, proud that her voice came out steady. Simone was just leaving. Simone stood with deliberate slowness, studying both their faces with the kind of perception that made Ivy nervous. "I'll talk to you later," she said meaningfully, then nodded to Levi. "Good morning, Mr. Burke." "Ms. Reed." After Simone left, the office felt charged with electricity. Levi closed the door behind him, a professional courtesy that now felt loaded with significance. And moved to the chair across from her desk, maintaining careful distance even as the air between them crackled with tension. "About Thursday night," he began, and Ivy could hear the carefully modulated control in his voice. "We don't have to talk about it," she said quickly, though every part of her wanted to dissect every word, every touch, every moment of that devastating conversation. "Don't we?" His eyes met hers directly. "We can't pretend it didn't happen, Ivy." The sound of her name on his lips made her chest tight with emotion. "I've been trying to." "And how's that working for you?" "Terribly," she admitted with a laugh that held no humor. "I can't stop thinking about what you said. About the 8 years, about everything you've done for my career. About the way you felt when I touched you." The words hung between them like a bridge she was afraid to cross. Because acknowledging that part. The way her entire body had come alive under his hands, the way she'd felt more herself in those moments than she had in months, would mean admitting that her engagement was built on a foundation of settling rather than soaring. "Levi," she began, but he held up a hand to stop her. "I need you to know something," he said, his voice intense with controlled emotion. "Whatever you decide, about your engagement, about us, about anything, I won't make it more difficult for you. I won't put pressure on you or make you feel guilty for the choice you make. What if I don't know what choice to make? Then you take the time you need to figure it out." The simple kindness in his voice made her eyes water. Here was a man who had loved her silently for 8 years, who had just confessed feelings that could change everything, and his primary concern was still her happiness and comfort. "What about what you want?" she asked. "What I want," he said carefully, "is for you to be happy. Whether that's with me or with Kai or with someone else entirely. That's very noble." "It's not noble," he said with a rueful smile. "It's self-preservation. I'd rather have you happy without me than miserable with me." Before she could respond, Micah Nichols appeared in the doorway looking unusually flustered. "Mr. Burke, I'm sorry to interrupt, but there's a situation developing that you both need to know about." Something in his tone made Ivy's blood turn cold. "What kind of situation?" "Preston Walsh from the Business Chronicle is in the lobby. He's asking to speak with both of you about your professional relationship." The words hit Ivy like a physical blow. Preston Walsh was the investigative reporter who specialized in corporate scandal and executive impropriety. If he was asking questions about her relationship with Levi, it meant someone had been watching them, talking about them, spreading rumors that could destroy both their careers. "What does he want to know?" Levi asked, his voice deadly calm in the way that meant he was furious. "He says he has information about conflicts of interest and inappropriate workplace relationships," Micah said diplomatically. "He mentioned something about dinner meetings and preferential treatment." Dinner meetings. The Patterson Project sessions that had felt more like dates than business obligations. The careful attention Levi paid to her ideas, the way he seemed to anticipate her needs, the obvious care he took with her career development. To an outside observer, it would look exactly like what it was, a man in love using his position to benefit the woman he cared about. "Where is he now?" Ivy asked. "Conference room B with legal. Mr. Burke, Diana is on her way up from the tech department." Diana Burke. Levi's sister, who ran the technology division and was reportedly fiercely protective of her brother. If she was getting involved, it meant this was serious. "What do we do?" Ivy asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "We handle it," Levi said, standing. "Together." The next hour passed in a blur of uncomfortable questions and careful answers. Preston Walsh was everything Ivy had expected. Sharp, persistent, with the kind of smile that suggested he already knew more than he was letting on. He asked about their working relationship, about the timeline of her promotions, about whether personal feelings had ever influenced professional decisions. Through it all, Levi remained calm and controlled, answering every question with diplomatic precision while never quite confirming or denying the underlying implications. But Ivy could see the tension in his shoulders, the careful way he chose his words, the protective way he deflected questions that might harm her reputation. "Ms. Hughes," Walsh said, turning his attention to her, "you've received several significant promotions during your tenure at Burke Industries. Would you say those were based purely on merit?" The question was a trap, and they all knew it. Answering yes would make her sound naive or dishonest. Answering no would confirm his suspicions about inappropriate influence. "My promotions have been based on my performance and the value I bring to the company," she said carefully. "Mr. Burke has always maintained the highest professional standards. Even during your private dinner meetings?" The phrase, private dinner meetings, made their professional strategy sessions sound sordid, inappropriate. Ivy felt heat rise in her cheeks but forced herself to maintain composure. "We occasionally discuss projects over working meals, just as many colleagues do. There's nothing unusual about that. What about your engagement, Ms. Hughes? How does your fiancé feel about these working dinners with your boss?" The personal question crossed a line, but it also revealed the angle Walsh was pursuing. He was trying to paint a picture of professional impropriety complicated by personal relationships, the kind of scandal that sold newspapers and destroyed careers. "My personal life is not relevant to this conversation," Ivy said firmly. "Isn't it? When workplace relationships affect professional decisions, the personal becomes very relevant indeed." "There is no workplace relationship," Levi said, his voice carrying an edge of steel. "Ms. Hughes is an exceptional employee who has earned every opportunity through her own merit. Any suggestion otherwise is not only incorrect but insulting to a woman who has worked tirelessly to build her career." The defense was fierce and protective, exactly what Ivy would have expected from Levi. It was also exactly the kind of passionate response that would fuel Walsh's suspicions about the true nature of their relationship. After Walsh left, Armed with nothing more than speculation but clearly convinced there was a story worth pursuing, Ivy found herself alone with Levi and Diana in the conference room. "Well," Diana said, studying both their faces with the kind of perception that ran in the Burke family, that was illuminating. "What do you think he knows?" Ivy asked. "I think he knows you care about each other more than colleagues typically do," Diana said bluntly. "The question is whether he can prove anything inappropriate actually happened." "Nothing inappropriate has happened," Levi said. "Technically," Diana agreed. "But Levi, anyone with eyes can see how you feel about her. And Ivy, you're not exactly subtle either." The observation hit too close to home. Ivy had thought she was being careful, professional, but apparently her feelings were more obvious than she'd realized. "What do we do?" she asked. "We prepare for the fact that this is probably going to become public," Diana said pragmatically. "We make sure all our documentation is in order, that there's no evidence of actual impropriety, and we hope the story dies for lack of substance." "And if it doesn't die?" Diana's expression grew serious. "Then we deal with the consequences." Have you ever felt torn between safety and passion? Between what makes sense and what makes your heart race? I'd love to hear about the moments when you had to choose between security and love. Your stories remind us we're not alone in these beautiful, complicated journeys of the heart. That evening, Ivy sat in her apartment staring at wedding vendor contracts spread across her coffee table, trying to focus on catering menus while her mind raced with everything that had happened. The reporter's questions had forced her to confront the reality of her situation. She was engaged to one man while falling in love with another, and that untenable position was about to become very public. Kai was in the kitchen making dinner, humming contentedly as he prepared what he insisted was her favorite pasta dish. The domestic scene should have been comforting, but instead it made her feel like a fraud. How could she sit here planning their wedding when every thought was consumed by another man? "How was work today?" Kai asked, settling beside her on the couch with 2 glasses of wine. "Complicated," she said, which was perhaps the understatement of the century. "The Patterson Project?" "Among other things." She accepted the wine but didn't drink it, using the glass as something to occupy her hands. "Kai, can I ask you something?" "Anything." "When you proposed, what made you certain I was the one?" The question seemed to surprise him. "That's an interesting question. Why do you ask?" "I'm just curious about your thought process." "How you knew?" Kai was quiet for a moment, considering. "I suppose it was the way everything felt, right with you. Easy. Like we fit together well, like we wanted the same things from life." "But did you feel?" She searched for the words. "Did you feel like you couldn't live without me? Like I was essential to your happiness?" "I felt like we could build a good life together," he said carefully. "Isn't that more important than dramatic feelings that might not last?" The answer was everything she'd expected and nothing she'd hoped for. Practical, sensible, built on compatibility rather than passion. The kind of love that made sense on paper but left her feeling hollow. "What about you?" he asked. "What made you say yes?" The question she'd been dreading, the one that got to the heart of everything wrong with their relationship. Because the honest answer was that she'd said yes because she couldn't think of a good reason to say no, because everyone expected it, because it was the logical next step with a good man who loved her. Not because her heart had been screaming yes. Not because she couldn't imagine life without him. Not because he made her feel like the most essential person in his world. "I said yes because I love you," she said, which was true but incomplete. "But?" Kai's perceptiveness surprised her. "But what?" "There's a but in your voice." "There has been for weeks, actually." The observation hit her like a physical blow because it meant her internal struggle was more obvious than she'd thought. If Kai could see it, how many other people had noticed her growing distance from their engagement? "I've just been stressed about the wedding planning," she said, which was a lie wrapped around a grain of truth. Is that all it is? The question hung between them, loaded with the kind of weight that suggested Kai suspected more than he was saying. For a moment, she considered telling him everything. About Levi's confession, about her own confused feelings, about the growing certainty that she was about to make the biggest mistake of her life. But looking at his kind, trusting face, she couldn't bring herself to destroy his happiness before she was certain of her own path. That's all it is, she lied. Later that night, as Kai slept peacefully beside her, Ivy lay awake staring at the ceiling and trying to imagine her future. 5 months from now, she would walk down the aisle of a cathedral that didn't matter to her, wearing a dress chosen by committee, marrying a man who made her feel safe but not alive. Unless she found the courage to choose differently. Unless she decided that feeling safe wasn't enough when the alternative was feeling everything. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like the first honest thing she'd acknowledged in months. Across town, Levi Burke stood at the windows of his penthouse apartment, looking out over the city he'd conquered but which suddenly felt empty without the woman who'd made it all meaningful. The reporter's questions had forced him to confront an uncomfortable truth: loving Ivy silently had been selfish as much as selfless. Selfish because it had allowed him to remain safe from rejection while still benefiting from her presence in his life. Selfish because he'd orchestrated her success to make himself feel useful, needed, important to her happiness. Selfish because he'd never given her the choice of loving him back. 8 years of silent devotion, and now everything was about to become very public, very complicated, very real. The careful distance they'd maintained was crumbling, and soon they'd have to decide whether to fight for something real or retreat to their separate, safer lives. The thought of losing her. Really losing her, not just to another man but to the complications he'd helped create, was unbearable. But the thought of destroying her career, her reputation, her carefully built life for the sake of his own feelings was worse. For 8 years, he'd loved her silently. Now he had to decide whether to love her loudly enough to fight for her, or quietly enough to let her go. The choice would define not just their futures, but the man he chose to be. And time was running out to decide. Chapter 4. The morning Preston Walsh's article went live. Ivy's world exploded before she'd even had her first cup of coffee. Her phone started buzzing at 6:23 a.m. with a text from Simone: "Girl, you need to see this. Business Chronicle Online. Now." The headline made her blood turn to ice: Burke Industries CEO's secret romance, 8 years of silent devotion or corporate favoritism? Ivy's hands trembled as she read the article on her phone, standing in her kitchen in her pajamas while Kai showered, completely unaware that their lives were about to implode. Walsh had been thorough, and devastating. He'd interviewed former employees who'd noticed Levi's unusual attention to her career. He'd documented her rapid promotions with suspicious precision. He'd even found a photograph of them from last month's company gala, captured in what the caption called, "an intimate moment of connection that transcends professional boundaries." In the photo, Levi was leaning close to her ear, saying something that had made her laugh, his hand resting lightly on her back. To anyone looking, it was obvious that whatever existed between them was far more than professional courtesy. The article was carefully written to avoid direct accusations while implying everything. It questioned whether her success had been earned or gifted. It suggested that Levi had abused his position of power. It painted their 8-year working relationship as a prolonged ethical violation disguised as mentorship. Most damaging of all, it included quotes from anonymous sources, suggesting that Ivy's engagement was a recent development designed to deflect attention from an inappropriate workplace relationship. Sources close to the situation indicate that Ms. Hughes's sudden engagement to marketing consultant Kai Jenkins may be an attempt to create distance from rumors that have circulated within Burke Industries for months, the article stated. Questions remain about whether this romance predates her engagement, and if so, what that means for the validity of her professional achievements. The implication was clear: she was either a woman who had built her career on her boss's infatuation, or she was cheating on her fiancé with said boss. Neither option left her reputation intact. Her phone rang, jarring her from her paralysis. Levi's name appeared on the screen, and she answered on the first ring. "Have you seen it?" His voice was tight with controlled fury. "Yes." The word came out as barely more than a whisper. "Ivy, I'm so sorry. This is my fault. I should have been more careful, should have protected you better. Stop." She cut him off before he could finish dismantling himself with guilt. "This isn't your fault. We both knew the risks." "The risks of what?" "Of caring about each other? Of being human?" The pain in his voice made her chest ache. Because that's what this was really about. The fact that they'd committed the unforgivable sin of feeling something real in a world that demanded they remain professional robots. "What do we do now?" she asked. "Now we face it. Together." The word "together" sent warmth flooding through her chest, followed immediately by panic. Because facing this together meant making choices she hadn't been ready to make, acknowledging truths she'd been avoiding, choosing between the life she'd planned and the life she was beginning to want. "Levi, my engagement, I know," he said softly. "I know this complicates everything. But Ivy, we can't let Walsh's twisted version of our story become the truth. We owe it to ourselves, and to Kai, to be honest about what this really is. What this really was. 8 years of silent devotion that had grown into something neither of them could ignore. A connection that transcended professional boundaries because it was built on something deeper than workplace attraction. A love that had been patient and selfless and was now demanding to be acknowledged. "I need to talk to Kai," she said, the words feeling like stepping off a cliff. "Are you sure you're ready for that conversation?" No, she wasn't ready. She would never be ready to break the heart of a good man who'd done nothing wrong except fall in love with a woman whose heart belonged elsewhere. But ready or not, the conversation was coming. Walsh's article had forced her hand. "I'm sure I can't let him read about this in the newspaper," she said. "Whatever you decide to tell him, whatever you decide about us, I'll respect it," Levi said. "But Ivy? Don't sacrifice your happiness to avoid hurting him. He deserves truth more than he deserves protection." The wisdom in his words hit her like a revelation. Because that's what she'd been doing, wasn't it? Protecting Kai from the truth of her feelings instead of respecting him enough to be honest. Choosing his temporary comfort over everyone's long-term happiness. "I have to go," she said as she heard the shower turn off in the bathroom. "Kai's getting ready for work." "I love you," Levi said quietly. "Whatever happens today, remember that." The call ended just as Kai emerged from the bathroom, humming contentedly as he toweled his hair. He looked so normal, so blissfully unaware of the storm that was about to hit their lives, that Ivy felt her heart break a little. "Good morning, beautiful," he said, leaning down to kiss her forehead. "You're up early." "I couldn't sleep." Which was true, though not for the reasons he'd assume. "Wedding stress?" he asked sympathetically, moving to the closet to select his clothes for the day. "Something like that." Ivy watched him get dressed with the kind of attention that came from knowing these might be among their last normal moments together. Kai was handsome, successful, the kind of man any woman would be lucky to marry. He deserved someone who loved him with the desperate intensity he brought to loving her. He deserved someone whose heart didn't belong to another man. "Kai," she said as he was adjusting his tie. "We need to talk." Something in her tone must have alerted him because he turned to face her fully, his expression growing serious. "That sounds ominous." "It's about us. About our engagement. Ivy." He moved closer, concern creasing his features. "Whatever's wrong, we can work through it. Cold feet are normal, it's not cold feet." The words came out sharper than she'd intended. "It's the realization that I can't marry you feeling the way I do about someone else." The silence that followed was deafening. She watched the words hit him, saw understanding dawn in his eyes, followed quickly by hurt and something that might have been relief. Someone else, he repeated slowly. Yes. How long? The simple question deserved an honest answer. I've been falling in love with him for weeks. Maybe months. Maybe longer than that, and I just didn't let myself acknowledge it. Kai sat heavily on the edge of their bed, running his hands through his hair. Is it someone I know? Does it matter? It matters to me. Ivy closed her eyes, steeling herself for what came next. It's Levi Burke. Another silence, longer this time. When she opened her eyes, Kai was staring at her with an expression she couldn't read. Your boss, he said finally. Yes. The man you have dinner meetings with. The one who calls you brilliant and looks at you like you hung the moon. The observation surprised her. You noticed? I'd have to be blind not to notice. Kai's smile was sad but not bitter. The question is whether you noticed that I noticed. What do you mean? I mean I've been watching you fall in love with another man for months, Ivy. I've seen the way you light up when you talk about work, the way you check your phone hoping for his messages, the way you've been going through the motions of our relationship while your heart was somewhere else entirely. The admission hit her like a physical blow. Why didn't you say anything? Because I kept hoping you'd choose me anyway. His voice was raw with honesty. Because I thought if I loved you hard enough, if I planned the perfect wedding and built the perfect life, you'd eventually feel for me what I felt for you. Kai, but that's not how love works, is it? He looked up at her with eyes that held 8 months of careful observation and growing understanding. You can't logic someone into loving you. You can't create passion through compatibility. The truth of his words settled over her like comfort and condemnation combined. Because he was right, she'd been trying to talk herself into loving him the way he deserved, and he'd been trying to earn a devotion that couldn't be purchased with kindness and planning. I'm so sorry, she whispered. Don't be sorry for not loving me enough, he said gently. Be sorry that you didn't trust me enough to be honest sooner. I didn't want to hurt you. Marrying me while in love with someone else would have hurt me more. The conversation that followed was painful but necessary. They talked about ending the engagement, canceling vendors, explaining to family and friends. Kai was gracious throughout, more gracious than she deserved, and by the time she left for work, Ivy felt emotionally drained but oddly relieved. The hardest conversation of her life was over. Now she had to face the second hardest, dealing with the professional fallout of Walsh's article. Burke Industries felt different when she walked through the lobby. Conversations stopped when she passed, eyes followed her progress to the elevators, and she could practically feel the weight of speculation and judgment from her colleagues. The whispers started immediately. Did you see the article about Ivy Hughes and Levi Burke? I always wondered how she got promoted so quickly. Do you think they've been having an affair this whole time? Each comment was like a small knife, cutting away at the professional reputation she'd spent 8 years building. Everything she'd achieved was now suspect, every success tainted by the suggestion that she'd slept her way to the top instead of earning her position through talent and hard work. Simone was waiting by her office door with coffee and the kind of fierce expression that meant she was prepared to go to war on Ivy's behalf. How are you holding up? She asked, closing the office door behind them. I've been better, Ivy admitted, sinking into her chair. I broke up with Kai this morning. Simone's eyebrows shot up. You did what now? I couldn't marry him. Not feeling the way I do about Levi. And how do you feel about Levi? Like I've been lying to myself for 8 years about what love is supposed to feel like. Simone studied her face for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Well, it's about damn time. That's it? That's all you have to say? Honey, I've been watching you go through the motions of your engagement for months. I've seen how you light up around that man, how you've been more yourself in the past few weeks than you've been since you started dating Kai. Simone settled into her chair with the satisfied expression of someone whose suspicions had been confirmed. The only surprise is that it took you this long to figure it out. Before Ivy could respond, there was a sharp knock on her door. Both women looked up to see Diana Burke standing in the doorway, her expression grim. "Ivy, I need to speak with you," Diana said. "Alone." Simone gathered her things and left, but not before squeezing Ivy's shoulder in support. After the door closed, Diana moved to the window, staring out at the city skyline for a long moment before speaking. "I've spent the morning doing damage control," she said finally. "The board is meeting this afternoon to discuss the situation." "What kind of discussion?" "The kind where they decide whether you and Levi still have jobs tomorrow." The words hit Ivy like a physical blow. She'd known there would be consequences, but somehow she'd convinced herself they'd be manageable. Career limiting, perhaps, but not career ending. "What are our options?" she asked. "Limited." Diana turned to face her, and Ivy could see the family resemblance in the steel behind her eyes. "You could deny everything, claim the article is based on speculation and coincidence. You could transfer to another department to eliminate the direct reporting relationship. Or one of you could resign." Resignation. The word hung in the air like a death sentence. Either she would have to give up the career she'd built, or Levi would have to walk away from the company he'd created. "He won't resign," Ivy said with certainty. "Burke Industries is his life's work. And you won't let him sacrifice it for you," Diana observed. "Which puts you in an impossible position. Unless we can convince the board that there's been no impropriety." "Can you?" Diana's voice was gentle but skeptical. "Can you honestly tell them that your personal relationship hasn't affected your professional dynamic?" The question struck at the heart of everything. Because the truth was, Levi's feelings for her had affected her career. Every opportunity, every promotion, every moment of support and encouragement had been motivated by love. The fact that she hadn't known didn't change the reality of what had happened. "No," she said quietly. "I can't tell them that." "Then we need to prepare for the worst." The board meeting was scheduled for 3 o'clock, giving Ivy time to prepare her defense and consider her options. She spent the morning reviewing her performance evaluations, gathering evidence of her qualifications and achievements, building a case for why her success had been earned rather than gifted. But even as she compiled the documentation, she couldn't shake the feeling that she was fighting a losing battle. Because the truth was more complex than any performance review could capture. Yes, she was qualified. Yes, she'd worked hard. But she'd also been loved by a man in a position to help her, and that love had influenced every aspect of her career whether she'd known it or not. At 2:45, she met Levi outside the boardroom. He looked tired, stressed, but determined in a way that made her chest tight with emotion. "Ready?" he asked. "No," she admitted. "But let's do this anyway." The boardroom felt like a courtroom as they entered. 12 members of Burke Industries' board of directors sat around the polished conference table, their expressions ranging from concern to openly hostile. Ivy recognized most of them. Successful business leaders who valued reputation above all else, who would sacrifice individual careers to protect the company's image. "Mr. Burke, Ms. Hughes," the chairman began, his voice coolly professional. "I'm sure you understand why we're here." "We do," Levi said, his voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. "And we're prepared to address any concerns you might have." What followed was the most brutal hour of Ivy's professional life. Question after question about the timeline of their relationship, the nature of their professional interactions, the potential for conflicts of interest. Each query felt like an accusation, each answer scrutinized for signs of deception or impropriety. "Ms. Hughes," one board member said, leaning forward with predatory interest, "you've received several significant promotions during your tenure here. Can you honestly say those were based purely on merit?" The question was a trap designed to make her sound either naive or dishonest. But looking around the table at these powerful men and women who'd already decided her guilt, Ivy felt something shift inside her chest. "My promotions were based on my performance and the value I bring to this company," she said firmly. "But if you're asking whether Mr. Burke supported my career development, then yes, he did. Just as he's supported dozens of other employees over the years. But not with the same personal investment," another board member suggested. "No," Ivy said, and her honesty seemed to surprise them. "Not with the same personal investment. Because he believed in my potential in a way that went beyond professional obligation." Levi's eyes met hers across the table, and she could see both admiration and concern in his expression. She was telling the truth, but it was a truth that could destroy them both. "And you were unaware of his feelings?" the chairman asked skeptically. "I was unaware," she confirmed. "But that doesn't change the fact that his support helped shape my career. It also doesn't change the fact that I earned every opportunity through my own work and talent." Nevertheless, another board member interjected, "The appearance of impropriety is almost as damaging as actual impropriety. The company's reputation is at stake." "Then perhaps," Ivy said, surprising herself with her boldness, "the company should focus on the substance of our work rather than the speculation of a gossip columnist." The room fell silent. Ivy realized she'd just challenged the board of directors in a way that could end her career permanently, but she couldn't bring herself to regret it. "Ms. Hughes," the chairman said slowly, "are you suggesting that the board is overreacting?" "I'm suggesting that two people developing feelings for each other shouldn't be treated like a corporate crisis," she said, her voice growing stronger with each word. "I'm suggesting that our personal relationship has never interfered with our professional obligations, and that punishing us for finding happiness together sends a troubling message about this company's values." The silence stretched for an eternity before the chairman spoke. "We'll need some time to discuss this matter privately. Please wait outside while we deliberate." In the hallway outside the boardroom, Ivy felt her composure finally cracking. "I can't believe I just lectured the board of directors," she said, pacing the length of the corridor. "You were magnificent," Levi said, catching her hand to stop her nervous movement. "You said everything I wanted to say but couldn't. I probably just ended both our careers. Maybe. Or maybe you just saved them." They waited for what felt like hours but was probably only 30 minutes before being called back into the boardroom. The chairman's expression was unreadable as they took their seats. After extensive discussion, he began, "The board has reached a decision." Ivy held her breath, preparing for the worst. "While we acknowledge that your relationship violates current company policy regarding disclosure, we also recognize that no actual impropriety has occurred." Relief flooded through Ivy so quickly she felt dizzy. "Therefore, we're prepared to approve your relationship under the following conditions." Conditions. There were always conditions. "First," the chairman continued, "Ms. Hughes will be transferred to a different department to eliminate the direct reporting relationship. Second, both of you will participate in a public statement clarifying the timeline and nature of your relationship. Third, any future violations of company policy will result in immediate termination." "And if we don't agree to these conditions?" Levi asked. "Then one of you will need to find employment elsewhere." It wasn't the unconditional acceptance Ivy had hoped for, but it was a solution that allowed them to stay together without destroying their careers. "We accept," Levi said, speaking for both of them. "Excellent. Ms. Hughes, HR will discuss your transfer options tomorrow. In the meantime, I suggest you both prepare for significant media attention." As they left the boardroom, Ivy felt simultaneously relieved and terrified. They'd won the battle, but the war for public opinion was just beginning. "How do you feel about being transferred?" Levi asked as they walked back toward their offices. "Honestly? Relieved," she said. "Working for the man I love was always going to be complicated. And the public statement? Necessary. We get to tell our story our way instead of letting Walsh control the narrative. They stopped outside her office, acutely aware that every interaction was now being watched and analyzed by their colleagues. "Thank you," Levi said quietly. "For what?" "For fighting for us. For being willing to risk everything." "You've been risking everything for me for 8 years," she replied. "It was my turn to be brave. What happens now?" "Now," Ivy said, feeling lighter than she had in months, "we stop hiding. We stop pretending. We love each other openly and let the world deal with it." "I love you," he said, not caring who might be listening. "I love you too," she replied. Finally, loudly, and completely. As Ivy settled into her office to prepare for whatever came next, she realized that she felt more herself than she had in years. Fighting for their relationship hadn't just saved their careers. It had shown her what she was capable of when she stopped playing it safe and started living authentically. For 8 years, Levi Burke had loved her silently, patiently, selflessly. Now it was her turn to love him loudly, boldly, without reservation. And if the world had a problem with that, the world could adjust. Because some things were worth fighting for. Some love was worth any risk. And some happiness was worth choosing again and again, no matter what it cost. Chapter 5. 1 year later, Ivy Burke stood at the floor-to-ceiling windows of her new corner office, watching the sunrise paint the city in shades of gold and possibility. The nameplate on her door read, Director of Strategic Marketing, a position she'd earned through her own merit in her new department, free from any suggestion of favoritism or conflict of interest. The past 12 months had been a whirlwind of challenges, growth, and the kind of deep, abiding happiness she'd never imagined possible. The public statement she and Levi had given to the Business Chronicle had reframed their story from scandal to romance, a narrative of patient love finally acknowledged, of two professionals who had maintained the highest ethical standards even while navigating complex personal feelings. The interview had been nerve-wracking but ultimately liberating. Sitting beside Levi in the Chronicle's offices, she'd told their story honestly. 8 years of professional collaboration that had grown into friendship, then into something deeper. She'd emphasized that her career achievements had been earned through her own talent and dedication, while acknowledging that Levi's support had been motivated by feelings she hadn't known existed. "Love doesn't diminish achievement," she'd said in that interview, words that had since been quoted in several business publications. "It amplifies it. When someone believes in your potential the way Levi believed in mine, it doesn't make your success less valid, it makes it more meaningful." The public response had been overwhelmingly positive. In an era of corporate scandals and executive misconduct, their story of patient, respectful love had resonated with people hungry for authentic human connection. The fact that they'd followed proper protocols once their relationship became romantic, that Ivy had willingly transferred departments to eliminate any conflict of interest, had demonstrated their commitment to professional integrity. Burke Industries had benefited from the positive publicity, with several major clients specifically mentioning their appreciation for a company that valued both personal happiness and professional ethics. But the real transformation hadn't been professional. It had been personal. "Admiring your empire?" Levi's voice made her turn from the window, and even after a year of marriage, the sight of him still made her breath catch. He stood in her doorway holding 2 cups of coffee, his dark hair slightly mussed from his morning run, wearing the kind of casual Friday attire that made him look more approachable than the intimidating CEO persona he wore during board meetings. "Just thinking about how much has changed," she said, accepting the coffee and breathing in the vanilla creamer he'd remembered without asking. "Regrets?" he asked, settling into the chair across from her desk with the easy familiarity of a man who belonged in every space of her life. "About what?" "Marrying the man who spent 8 years orchestrating my happiness from the shadows? About finally understanding what it means to be loved completely?" She moved around her desk to perch on the edge, close enough to touch. Not a single one. The wedding had been everything the elaborate cathedral ceremony with Kai would not have been: intimate, personal, focused on the promise they were making rather than the image they were projecting. They'd married in the small chapel where Levi's parents had exchanged vows 35 years earlier, surrounded by family and close friends who had watched their love story unfold with varying degrees of awareness and amusement. Diana had served as Ivy's matron of honor, having appointed herself the guardian of their relationship from the moment she'd realized what was happening between them. "About time," had been her response when they'd announced their engagement 6 months after the board meeting. "I was beginning to think I'd have to lock you both in a conference room until you figured it out." Simone had given a maid of honor speech that had left half the wedding party in tears, talking about watching Ivy transform from someone going through the motions of happiness to someone radiating authentic joy. "Love isn't about finding someone to complete you," she'd said, raising her glass in toast. "It's about finding someone who inspires you to complete yourself. And Levi Burke, you have inspired our girl to become the most magnificent version of herself." Even Kai had attended the wedding, having found his own happiness with a travel photographer who shared his love of adventure and spontaneity. "I'm glad you found your Sarah," Ivy had told him at the reception, referring to the college girlfriend he'd told her about during their breakup conversation. "I'm glad you found your Levi," he'd replied with genuine warmth. "He's been staring at you like you hung the moon since the ceremony started." "He's been staring at me like that for 8 years, she'd said. "I just finally learned to notice." Now, sitting in her office with her husband of 6 months, Ivy marveled at how natural it all felt. How right. The fears she'd harbored about mixing personal and professional relationships had proven unfounded. If anything, having Levi as both her partner and her colleague had enhanced both aspects of their connection. "I have something for you," Levi said, reaching into his jacket pocket to pull out a small wrapped box. "It's not my birthday," Ivy protested, though she accepted the gift with curiosity. "It's the anniversary of the day you walked into Burke Industries and changed my life forever," he said. 8 years and 1 month ago." Inside the box was a key, brass, old-fashioned, beautiful in its simplicity. But this one was different from the symbolic key he'd given her at their engagement party. This one was clearly functional, clearly meant for something specific. "What does it open?" she asked. "The house I bought for us in Napa Valley," he said, his voice soft with the kind of vulnerability that still surprised her. "The one with the vineyard views and the writing studio I had built for the novel you mentioned wanting to write someday." Ivy's eyes filled with tears as she understood the magnitude of what he was telling her. Not just that he'd bought them a retreat from the demands of corporate life, but that he'd been listening to dreams she'd barely acknowledged to herself. That he'd been planning their future with the same careful attention he'd once devoted to orchestrating her career. "You remembered that I wanted to write," she whispered. "I remember everything you've ever told me you wanted," he said simply. "Remembering your dreams and helping make them possible, that's what love does." The truth of his words settled over her like blessing and revelation combined. Because that's what Levi had been doing for 8 years, wasn't it? Listening to her dreams and quietly, persistently making them possible. Not because she'd needed his help, but because loving someone meant paying attention to what made them happy and doing whatever you could to nurture that happiness. "I love you," she said, the words carrying 8 months of marriage, 12 months of acknowledged love, and 8 years of unconscious devotion finally recognized. "I love you too," he replied. "For 8 years and counting. For the rest of our lives." When he kissed her, it was with the same reverent intensity he'd brought to their first kiss in that elevator, but also with the confidence of a man who no longer had to hide his feelings. A man who could love his wife openly, proudly, without reservation or apology. "I have a confession," Ivy said when they broke apart. "Only one?" "You're slipping. I've been thinking about having dinner at Le Petit Jardin tonight. To celebrate." Levi's smile was the one that still made her knees weak. The one that lit up his entire face and made her feel like the most fascinating person in the world. "The place where everything changed between us. The place where you finally told me the truth about how you felt. And where you finally admitted you felt something too." It seems appropriate, she said. Full circle. I'll make a reservation, he said, standing to leave. Somewhere we can talk without interruption. About what? About the future we're building. About the dreams we're making real. He paused in her doorway, looking back with an expression that held infinite love and infinite possibility. About how sometimes the best love stories take 8 years to unfold. That evening, sitting across from each other at the same restaurant where their careful professional distance had first cracked, Ivy marveled at how different everything felt. A year ago, they'd sat in these same chairs as boss and employee, fighting an attraction they couldn't acknowledge. Tonight, they sat as husband and wife, partners in every sense of the word, planning a future that belonged entirely to them. Do you remember what you said that night? Levi asked, reaching across the table to take her hand. About settling for a life that fits instead of one that feels right? I remember thinking you were talking about my engagement to Kai. I was talking about both of us, he said. I was settling for loving you silently because it felt safer than risking rejection. You were settling for a relationship that looked perfect because it felt easier than waiting for something real. And now? Now we know what it means to choose the life that feels right, even when it's complicated. The waiter brought champagne, Dom Perignon, the same vintage they'd served at their wedding, and Levi raised his glass in a toast. To 8 years of patient love finally rewarded, he said. To the courage to choose passion over safety. To the woman who taught me that some things are worth waiting for, and some things are worth fighting for. To the man who loved me before I knew how to love myself, Ivy replied. To 8 years of proof that the best things in life are worth waiting for. They touched glasses with the soft chime of crystal meeting crystal, the sound somehow containing all the promises they'd made and all the dreams they were building together. What are you thinking about? Levi asked, watching her face in the candlelight. I'm thinking about 20-year-old me, choosing safe over scary at every turn, she said. I'm thinking about how grateful I am that you were patient enough to wait for me to grow into someone brave enough to choose love. I'm thinking about 30-year-old me, convinced that loving you silently was noble instead of cowardly, he replied. I'm grateful you were brave enough to fight for us when I was still too afraid to risk everything. We make a good team. The best, he agreed. In business and in life. As they walked home through the city streets where they'd both built their careers, where they'd found each other despite the odds, Ivy felt a deep sense of completion. Not because Levi completed her. She'd learned that she was whole on her own, but because loving him had helped her become the fullest, most authentic version of herself. Thank you, she said as they paused outside their building. For what this time? For seeing me before I saw myself. For believing in my dreams when I was too afraid to voice them. For showing me what it means to be loved not for who I could become, but for who I already was. Thank you, he said, pulling her into his arms under the streetlights, for choosing me. For being brave enough to risk everything for love. For proving that some things are worth 8 years of waiting. For 8 years and counting, she asked, echoing the words that had become their promise. For the rest of our lives, he confirmed, sealing the vow with a kiss that tasted like champagne and possibility and the kind of love that changes everything. As they rode the elevator to their penthouse, the same elevator where everything had changed between them, Ivy thought about the journey that had brought them here. The years of careful professional distance, the moment of devastating revelation, the choice to fight for something real instead of settling for something safe. She thought about the woman she'd been a year ago, engaged to a good man she didn't love completely, going through the motions of a life that looked perfect but felt empty. And she thought about the woman she was now, married to a man who had loved her patiently and completely, living a life that felt authentic and fulfilling and absolutely right. No regrets? Levi asked as they stepped into their home. Not a single one, she said with absolute certainty. You? Only that it took us 8 years to get here. It took us exactly as long as it needed to, she said, understanding the truth of it as she spoke. We both had to become the people we needed to be to love each other the way we deserve to be loved. And now? Now we love each other loudly, proudly, and completely. Now we build the life we both dreamed of but were too afraid to ask for. Standing in their home, looking out over the city that had witnessed their love story unfold, Ivy Hughes Burke finally understood what Simone had meant about finding someone who inspires you to complete yourself. Levi Burke hadn't completed her. He'd inspired her to become brave enough to complete herself. To choose authenticity over safety, passion over convenience, truth over comfortable lies. And in return, she'd given him permission to love openly after 8 years of silence. She'd shown him that his patient devotion hadn't been wasted, that some love stories require time to unfold, and that the best things in life are always worth fighting for. What does this story teach us about the courage to love authentically? Have you ever discovered that someone's support came from a place of deep, hidden love? How did recognizing true devotion change your perspective on relationships? Sometimes the greatest love stories aren't about finding someone new, they're about finally seeing someone who's been there all along. They're about choosing vulnerability over protection, truth over convenience, and the messy beauty of real connection over the safe comfort of settling. Levi Burke loved Ivy Hughes for 8 years in silence, building his life around her happiness while never expecting anything in return. But real love, the kind that transforms lives and creates lasting happiness, requires courage from both people. It requires the bravery to speak truth, to take risks, to choose what feels right over what looks perfect. If this story touched your heart, please hit that like button. It means the world to me and helps other souls find these meaningful tales of love. Share in the comments, when did you realize that love isn't about finding someone to complete you, but finding someone who inspires you to complete yourself? Remember, beautiful souls, that you deserve the kind of love that sees you completely, supports your dreams unconditionally, and never asks you to be anything less than your authentic self. Sometimes that love has been waiting patiently in your life for years, hidden behind professional courtesy or friendship, waiting for the moment when you're brave enough to recognize it. Don't wait 8 years to tell someone you love them. Don't wait 8 years to choose passion over safety. And never, ever settle for a life that looks perfect on paper but leaves your heart empty. True love, the kind that heals old wounds and creates new dreams, is always worth the risk. Always worth the fight. Always worth choosing again and again, for the rest of your beautifully complicated, authentically lived life. The best love stories begin when two people decide to stop hiding from the truth of what they feel and start building a life worthy of that truth. 8 years of patient love, rewarded at last. 8 years of silent devotion, finally given voice. 8 years of waiting for the right moment to choose each other. Sometimes, the greatest love stories are worth every moment of the wait.